All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Wilson. I work at the Illinois State Water Survey and manage wateroperator.org. And this is the second webinar in our free webinar series that we're putting on this year on resources that are available. And today we're going to talk about groundwater and well care. I have several people with me. I'll get into that in a second. I want to go through some logistics here. There we go. So our webinar is not approved for CEUs unless you've been informed by your state that it is. I talked to an operator in Louisiana this morning whose state sent something out and said they'd give an hour credit. So I know it is in Louisiana. We're doing this as a service, really just to help operators understand more about groundwater in their wells. And at the end, I'll mention we do have a class that is worth 2 hours of CEU credit in 26 states. That's an online self-paced class, and I'll get into that at the end. So for today, though, if you can turn in a certificate to your state to get credit, that's our email address, info@wateroperator.org. And if you contact us, we can get your certificate for today's webinar, as well as if you have forms that need to be filled out by your certification body, we can help you with that. This is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. The one last month that Hideyuki Terashima did on RTCR is already on there, and you can find it on our event calendar. If you have questions, I know a number of you asked questions, and we're going to bring those up today. A lot of those we'll try to answer today, but if you have additional questions of things that I say today or others, Dick Meiliger is with us today from Municipal Well and Pump. You can type into the chat box or question box. And Jennifer Wilson and Katie Buckley are both online and they're monitoring that. And we have a Google Doc that we share. And so at the end, they'll type all the questions in that you asked today during the webinar, and I'll pull that up and we'll try to answer them on the fly. And Dick's here because I'm not a municipal well expert. I'm a groundwater hydrologist. And so if there's something that one of us can't answer, we will say we can't answer it and we'll get back to you and I'll explain that then. So there is time for follow-up questions. And the last thing I want to mention, we are at home. So my daughter's doing her homework right now. She may decide to interrupt. It's not the same internet service we have at the U of I that's hardwired and super fast. And we've learned that folks like to mow during the day, even on weekdays now that everybody's stuck at home. So there may be some additional noises or internet service may cut out. We did a webinar yesterday for private well owners and we had about 300 people on. And we lost my audio for about a minute and a half. And so that could happen. If it does, just hang on, it'll come back. And hopefully that won't happen. We've tried to take do some things a little differently in our house here to make sure that doesn't happen this time. Okay, so as I said, I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the Illinois State Water Survey. With me is Jennifer Wilson. I didn't know Katie was actually going to be on the call, so she got her name, she got slided today. But Jennifer is our communications lead, and she's fielding questions online, and Katie's here for support as well. She is part of our private well program that we do webinars every month and have a class for well owners around the country. And lastly, Dick Meiliger is with us from Municipal Well and Pump. Whenever I saw the questions that we started receiving from you all as you registered for this event, it became really clear to me that I wasn't going to be able to answer a lot of them. They're much more focused on municipal wells, and I realized how long it's been since I've even been near a rig that puts in a municipal well. So I reached out to Dick, and he graciously agreed to provide many of the answers to the questions that you'll see at the end today that we put on our slide deck. And as well as he's here to help with the questions you all asked today that I'm likely not to be able to answer. So with that, thanks for being here, Dick, and we'll move forward. So quickly, a little background. The Illinois State Water Survey is unique in the country. It's a sister agency to our State Geological Survey and Natural History Survey. So we are a scientific survey like other states have. We're just focused on water. We have a groundwater section, surface water, all those things. And it was formed by chance because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks back in the 1890s. And so the Water Survey was formed to investigate those things, try to help systems that were just getting into the water treatment business and just developing wastewater facilities and even sewer systems back at the end of the day. And so our job was to go out and investigate some of these outbreaks, what might cause them, and things like that. So our records go back that far. And this is just one example. There was a typhoid outbreak in Pana, Illinois in 1916. And this is one of the figures that's in the Pana book that's still in our files. So we, as the community grows over time and they add new wells or add different things related to their water wastewater supply, those end up in our well records at the water survey. And this particular thing, we investigated whether it was that half the system was sewered and the other half wasn't, or if it was their water system because they had a new treatment plant and they didn't put it online. And it turned out it was the Pana Ice Cream Company, which also sold milk. Back in that time, everyone went to one large vat, if you will, and used a shared bucket to get milk. And that's what caused the outbreak there. And all of that's identified in their files still today. Just some other examples. I'm also in charge of our data management and outreach at the Water Survey, and we've been going through our files and scanning a lot of old photos and things that were happening. We've been involved with pump tests. Here we're using an orifice bucket to do a pump test, going back all the way into the teens. This is putting spacers on in a well at the U of I in the 20s. A lot different job back then it is today. Look at all those rivets and putting those on. So it's a different world today, surely, but we've got a background in that, and we still do pump tests and things like that for folks. I'm in the groundwater science section, so we not only collect data and do research, but we also provide public service. We house the state's well logs, water well logs, and so we have over 400,000 well records for the estimated 800,000 or so wells that are out there, both municipal and private. We also have observational networks where we monitor wells. We work with a lot of the communities in Illinois that measure their own water levels, and they provide that data to us. Illinois has a water inventory program that requires every municipal water supply to provide their annual water use to us. And we also provide services like aquifer testing and other things to help communities. We model, we do pump tests, a lot of public outreach. And then on the research side, I mentioned modeling. Contaminant studies. The head of our section is a geochemist and has been involved in a lot of interesting groundwater work in that respect. But we look at well interference issues. We do aquifer assessment studies for communities and areas where they may want to put in a regional supply and things like that. So we're in the game, if you will, and we run wateroperator.org through a grant from RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and it's funded through US EPA. And the goal behind wateroperator.org, and I'll get into that later, is to provide resources and support for systems under 10,000. And those tend to be the ones that are more out of compliance and some of those issues. And so our side is everything's free and publicly available. And the idea behind it is we're here to be a resource for you all as operators. So we're going to do a little groundwater 101. A couple things I want to explain. My book, what we try to, and I work a lot with private well owners, as I mentioned. What's important is that you need to understand your well and your well system and the geology at your location where your well is well enough to ask the right questions, make sure that you're doing the right things, that you're not spending money unwisely for your community, all those things. And so understanding the difference, for instance, between a porous system, which is sand and gravel, in an aquifer, and a fractured system is one of those issues, whether you have a bedrock well or a sand and gravel well. So a porous system like this, and this is just a diagram explaining that porosity is the amount of airspace between all the grains of sand in a sand and gravel aquifer. And in an aquifer, all those pore spaces are filled up with water. So a really uniform sand may have a porosity of 30%, meaning 30% of that volume is actually water. So put that in real terms, if we have an aquifer that's got 100 feet, it's 100 foot thick and it's full of water, whether it's artesian or whether it's water table, if you took all the sand away, you'd still have 30 feet of water over the entire expanse of that aquifer, which could be multiple counties, very large. So sand and gravel aquifers are typically very productive. And that's why we see a lot of irrigation wells that pump, 1,500 gallons a minute or so in sand and gravel, a lot of times in sandy areas along bottoms, river bottoms and things like that. So the difference with a bedrock well is sandstone has some secondary porosity where you may have some water in the actual rock, but for most fractured systems, most types of bedrock, the water's flowing through the cracks and fissures in the rock. It's not actually flowing through the rock. So you can look at it like it's pipe flow, but it means two things. One, there could be much less water available because it's just in the fractures. And it also could mean water's coming from further away to get to your well if you're pumping at a high capacity, if there's only a few fractures. I worked with a bunch of irrigators up in Kankakee County, Illinois, and you could tell on an aerial photo by the tree, where the trees were growing, where the fractures were, because it was pretty close to the surface and they had enough water in those places. And they knew where to drill their wells for irrigation just by sight, and they tried to line them all up on those fractures, because if they missed, I had one guy who told me he had his well, he called it his Cadillac well. He spent $55,000 on it for an irrigation well, and he only got about 40 gallons a minute when he was looking for 1,800, I think. So understanding the differences in fracture flow and if you have a bedrock well, and those things are important. So the other side of thing, material can be different. So porous material can be well sorted or poorly sorted. If it's more uniform sand, it's likely to actually have more porosity and more water per unit volume than if it's poorly sorted. And that's typically you have sand and gravel aquifers for one of two reasons. Either it's because it was laid by a glacier, or it's alluvial, which means it's along a river bottom or was deposited by water, flowing water. So along all of our river systems, a number of communities have their wells in those sand bottoms, and that's alluvial sands. They tend to be graded by size because the bigger particles fall out first. And so at the very top of an aquifer that's an alluvial aquifer, it's usually pretty fine sand. And sometimes, every time there's a flood, some of that can shift. Versus the bottom three here are fractures or bedrock images. And there's lots of kinds of bedrock: sandstone, dolomite, granite, limestone, and dolomitic limestone. And so it really depends on the type of rock. If you're in granite, if you're in an area like in the Rockies, where the only thing you have is a granite to drill into, we see private wells that are 400 feet deep in granite that only pump a quarter or half a gallon a minute. It's just the porosity, if you will, there is less than 1% in some cases, where in Kentucky, Tennessee, all the areas with karst and dolomitic limestone, Mammoth Cave, all those places, sometimes you can have very large crevices in that rock because water over millions of years has eroded it away and created these large pools, filled tubes in the ground. So it really depends on where you're at and what your geology is, and a lot of times you have no say there. The other thing about these like caverns in limestone image, you see all these fractures that go up to the surface. Once those cracks find a way to have water get down into the aquifer from the surface, that's where sinkholes come from. They get larger over time. And so what we see in areas like Pike County, Illinois, which is in a karst area, over 80% of the private well samples there anyway have E. coli and coliform. And so there's no way to stop a surface influence in those places. And what's happened, like in Pike County, is they put in a regional water supply, and they supply water to a lot of areas, even out in the country, to private homes. So permeability is the other thing after porosity that is a big issue.
Okay, Steve, I pause you for a second.
Yeah.
The screen that we're seeing right now as the audience is your PowerPoint's notes section. So I think you need to switch your screen so it shows the actual presentation rather than your notes.
Oh, well, thank you for telling me. Right there. All right. Oh yeah, look at that. So one of the ways we've tried to alleviate the fact that I didn't have audio yesterday for a minute and a half was we moved upstairs to where we can hardwire our connection. So I'm not on my normal setup. and there's a second monitor hooked up, and clearly we had it on the wrong one. Thanks for telling me. Okay, sorry about the issue there. Is it look good now, Hideyuki?
Yep, looks perfect.
All right, thank you. Okay, so permeability is the other factor that can affect how much water is available to your well, if you will. And so it's a kind of a measure of velocity. It's not actually velocity, but it's similar in that it's measured in, here it's feet per day. And you can, it's how fast water will flow, which, you know, the water flows based on head difference, it's pressure. So if for the given same amount, same kind of sand or the same jar of sand, if the difference in height of the water from one point A to point B is more, the water will flow faster. But highly permeable like gravel, it's because it's got large pore spaces and it's easy for water to get through. So as it shows here, it can move as much as 3,000 feet a day. Interestingly, silt and clay towards the bottom on the left side, which are also highly porous, they can have just as much porosity. So they can have as much as 20 to 30% water in them, but the particles are so small, they're so hooked together, if you will, that you can see how, like in a clay, water flows 1 foot in 10,000 years, or could flow that slow. And so those are considered not aquifers, but aquatards or aquicludes, because they prevent water from moving freely through those units towards a well. And with bedrock, the permeability is really based on fractures and solution cavities, as it says in the first image there, except for sandstone, which can have some secondary porosity, but a lot of times it's cemented. And so the fractures are still the major source of flow. It just allows them to store a little more water than another type of bedrock. And so when you get into shales, you know, those are basically cemented clay. And so we went through drilled through till that's so hard that the driller thought it was shale, and we hit bedrock and it turned out it wasn't. But shale is basically impermeable, and it acts as a barrier to water flow vertically down to if there's an aquifer below that. And so recharge to a deeper aquifer below shale typically is really low. And so it's coming usually from the side somewhere at a distance away from the well. Okay. These are just some basic examples. I show this because it gives you an idea of if this was a horse trough full of that material and you poured a bucket of water over it, this is the wetting front you'd see going down through the material. And it's really just to show that, you know, in a sand and gravel, water's kind of just free flowing between all the grains. But in bedrock or granite, the crystalline bedrock is the granite, it's only going to flow through the fractures. And in the real world, this is still a simplified version with the sandstone and dolomite. You know, because the sandstone has secondary porosity, it may have some flow that's more sand-like, but you usually don't have just that one unit. In some places you do, but a lot of times you're relying on other types of bedrock that are intermixed that cause, you know, the flow direction could go wherever depending on pressure. This is just another good example. Iowa has this on the document they have for their well program. It really explains how things sit in the world. You know, we're in an area in Illinois and Iowa that has glacial drift. So we've had glaciation here, and that's what you see at the top where it says glacial drift. That's deposits, that's unconsolidated clay, silt, sand, gravel. And so in some places where the glaciers melted, this is a cross section, so you can see a well that's in a sand that's along a river. You may have intermittent sand and gravel layers where different glaciers receded and deposited sand or moved forward and scrape material up. But then when you get down to bedrock, again, this is still simplified. Bedrock is not flat. It usually is on a slope. And I'm not a geologist, so I'll leave it there. But you know, here in this case, the deep well is tapping probably the limestone and the sandstone. And that's the other thing. A lot of times, whenever you get into bedrock, you usually sometimes you're finishing a well in multiple units. So and that can be a problem. Sometimes one of those units has a different water chemistry than the other. And here's just a diagram to explain kind of the overall on water flow and how the water system works. And you can see some of the white letters. It's pretty blurry, I apologize. But the very bottom, the lower confined aquifer, water's flowing in a given direction. Rarely does it finds some outflow that's further away. It could be under there. We've dated water that's 50,000 years old. But shallower units typically have more turnover, if you will, as part of the water cycle. So an aquifer near a river, for instance, some of that discharges as base flow to a stream, evaporates, lands, infiltrates back in, and it creates this flow system that's been around ever since the current land surface was put here. And so understanding where you're at on that landscape and how a drought or flooding might influence things also matter, and understanding where your recharge areas are. And some of you, I'm sure, are aware of where those are if you're in a sandy area and you've got groundwater protection areas in some places. But it's just, this is a good overview of, the type of time frame it takes for water to move through the system, depending on how deep it can get or and those things. So a little bit about, and I debated whether or not to talk about dug or bored wells. Obviously, none of you as community water supplies have dug or bored wells. But this is also in the class as well, was really the original class we developed was originally for non-community water systems, which many times are very small systems, a restaurant, a campground, where they may have a dug or bored well. And since those folks might be on this, I decided to include it. Plus, it's good for you to know the differences and all of that. So, it really depends on your geology. You may have choices. Champaign County, where I live, there are at least 2 sand and gravel aquifers at different depths before you hit bedrock. And then you can also put a well in bedrock if you wanted to. Most people do not do that. There's no reason to go that deep and spend the extra money. But yeah, anyway, it really just depends on where you're at, but understanding the differences are important. So these are 3 examples of dug or bored wells, which are large diameter wells that basically get water from the shallow water table, and it infiltrates into these large 3-foot diameter or more well bores so that they can store water, because there isn't an aquifer here in the first place. And we see a lot of the upper left picture, a lot of really old hand dug wells that are still in use today. And the biggest problem with those is they're not up to any kind of code. And so if they're close to anything else, they can be a source of contamination. Here's 2 examples. We use this either, the picture that had the concrete tile on the top is the one on the left, and the one that looked like a normal drilled well is the one on the right. But down below, they're 3-foot diameter, usually 36-inch diameter. Sometimes now they're put in with Teflon, but they're meant to store water from the water table. So water's coming in from a pretty shallow place. As far as sand and gravel wells, the real issue here is if you have a sand and gravel well, your water's coming in through a screen. And if you have a bedrock well, it's more than likely open hole. So, the difference is for a community well, maybe you have 20 or 40 feet of screen, where a private well may only have 4 or 5 feet of screen, but the interval where water's coming into the well. So the wells like for Illinois American has here in Champaign County for Champaign-Urbana, they've drilled down, and I think they're 40-foot screens. I'm not 100% sure, but those are at, say, 200-foot depth. And so water's only coming in from 160 to 200, and the rest is solid pipe above that. And so, the screen size is based on the drill cuttings and the actual aquifer material, what size sand or gravel there might be there. And that's usually determined by the driller whenever they're putting in the well. And here's just a typical log. If you're not familiar with these or you don't have the logs for your well, you should. And that's one thing. Some folks leave that up to their consultant or their contractor, but you really need to understand, and this is a private well, but you can see the geology and explains static water level, at least in Illinois, and some other issues, how much they pump, and it gives you an idea of, in this case, this is a Mahomet well, which is the aquifer near here, And the bottom 10 feet is this coarse sand that's a very extensive aquifer, so they didn't need to go any further than that. And there's a lot of irrigation wells that pump out of the same aquifer. So the difference then with bedrock wells is most of the time you're trying to find fractures in a bedrock. So a lot of times, I think, the law says it has to be a minimum of 50 feet casing, at least I think in Illinois, and Dick can correct me if I'm wrong. But usually you only see the casing 10 to 20 feet into bedrock. And so you could have a 400-foot well, but there's only 60 feet of casing. And that means that water can come in anywhere from 60 feet down to 400. And so, because if you had this cased off, the fractures don't do you any good. And having an open hole, the rock itself acts as the casing, and it allows all those fractures to provide water to the well. And what that means too, though, is if it's not well fractured, or there aren't a lot of fractures or interconnected fractures, the water may be coming from just a few fractures, and that means it's probably coming over a longer distance. And so your chemistry can change, or some of these fractures may head towards the surface. And depending on your geology and how much overburden you have, it's good just to understand some of those risks. And I know as community water supplies, you're sampling frequently, so you're probably aware of if there's any of those issues. And this is just an example. Again, this is a non-community well. It's Camp Algonquin. All our well logs in Illinois are public domain. And so I use this example as much to show the geology and that the casing, they use black steel down to 190, or they use PVC down to 179, and then black steel from 179 to 199 to seed it in the rock. And then below that, it's open hole. And so even though this well is 260 feet deep, there's only 199 feet of casing. And so that's really the example we show here, how that actually works. We've seen wells, or I've seen wells in like in New York State before they were had to meet code that maybe have 15 or 20 feet, if that, casing, and they're 300 or 400-foot wells, but the bedrock's right at the surface in some areas is there. And so we see a lot of contamination in some of those bedrock wells, even though if you ask somebody, they'd say, well, I've got a 500-foot well. Yeah, but it's drawing water from 15 feet below land surface. A little bit, I'm not want to show Illinois per se, but it's a good example. So there are resource agencies in your state, whether that be your state geological survey, DNR, DEQ, a lot of different names, that, or even your USGS state office, that have mapped, monitored, and studied the aquifers in your state. So this map shows where all the major sand and gravel aquifers are, but it's also a map of the ancient buried river valleys in Illinois. So before there was any glaciation a million years ago, those areas in the center of the state were all rivers that were dug into the bedrock, very much like the Grand Canyon today. So then we were glaciated. We had 3 sets of glaciation that came through Illinois, and they filled that in. And as they melted, boulders fall out first, gravel falls out next, then sand, and then silt and clay. And then another glacier comes along and it deposits a second level and then a third level. And so these buried bedrock valleys that used to be rivers are now full of sand, and they become our major sand and gravel aquifers. And that's going to be true in any glaciated area of the country. So the northern third of the country, if you will. Otherwise, the only other sand and gravels would likely be along river bottoms today, where those areas have alluvial sand that's been deposited from flooding and just movement and all those things. So I bring that up because all this information is useful if you're in these areas. So for instance, going back to this other figure, the Mississippi now runs along the left edge of Illinois. That's our boundary. But before glaciation, the Mississippi didn't run along the state boundary today. It ran over through down to Peoria, where the Illinois River is today. And so groups like ours and the USGS and the state's geological surveys have mapped all this. They can give you information, water chemistry data for the aquifers. We work in cooperation with the communities in Illinois to those that measure water level data, provide some of that to us, and that helps us understand what's going on. And so we can produce products like this that actually can benefit everybody. And sometimes groundwater and geology is really complicated. And this is an example, the Muhammad. You see there's a public well here and several private wells. Depending on where you drill, you could put a private well in any of those blue units, but you probably want to put your public well that's going to be pumping, more than a couple hundred gallons a minute in the deep aquifer that's more extensive. And we have that information because of all the work that's been done in the past before us. And so you should develop a relationship with those folks is kind of my message. And because there's a lot of good information there. And for instance, many of you maybe have consultants that do all that stuff for you. We have consultants contact us every day for well information, water chemistry information, and they're doing that on behalf of communities in most cases. But my message is it's good for you to know some of this stuff as well and not just rely on the folks so you understand it better and you understand what's going on. And, I mentioned we have bedrock aquifers, and we have a deep bedrock aquifer. In the Chicago area, they pump out of a deep sandstone there that's in some places over 1,800 feet deep, where in other areas of the state, we may have some communities along river bottoms that have 30-foot, 40-foot wells. As an example, and this is really getting to flow. So the red line here, the dashed line, is the water level elevation in the Ironton Galesville, the deeper aquifer there. And so a lot of these wells are cased in both the St. Pete sandstone and the Ironton Galesville. And so that's why both are shown here, because by putting all those wells in and having them open hole between the two, they're interconnected and the water levels are becoming closer together. They used to not be that way, but they are today. And so, but what you can see, the arrows indicate the direction of water flow. And it's not intuitive that on the right side, water's flowing kind of uphill. It doesn't flow based on elevation, it flows based on pressure. And because there's less pressure where the water levels are lowest, like in the middle there where the dashed lines are, is lower than on the far right side. So water's flowing towards the middle where the water levels are lowest. Think of it like if you poured a glass of water on a table. If I pour it on the left end of the table and then I pick the left end up, where does the water run? It runs downhill. The same way if I have a juice box and I squeeze it, what happens? Water comes out the straw, or the juice comes out of the straw because you've increased the pressure on the system. And that's exactly how this works. Somewhere there's a recharge area that's raising the elevation on the left side of this, causing water levels to be higher. That's one thing. And the other is pumpage can also lower water levels such that it changes the direction of flow. So even if the natural flow system originally was always from left to right, we've changed that by pumping so much water out of those aquifers. Here's another example of that. This is a little difficult. I tried to use this because it's from Iowa and they put it together. But if you look where the two wells are finished, where the screens are that are in the artesian aquifer, the recharge area for that aquifer is way off to the right, up at the land surface. And that's because the geology isn't flat. And so that outcrops that could be 50 miles or 100 miles away. But because the water's coming into the aquifer there, that's where water levels are highest. And it causes the dashed line near the top is the water surface. And you can see the artesian well, that's the leftmost well, or the rightmost well, you can see where the water level is. It says piezometric level because it's a pressure head. The aquifer, the top of the aquifer is down by the top of the screen, but water rises in that well because it's under artesian pressure, which means it's pressure greater than atmospheric. And if you're in a low spot on the ground, on the land surface, like over by a stream, the flowing artesian well in the same aquifer, if you place that up to an elevation that matched the other well, the water level would be flat there, but it's lower because water's coming out from the flowing well. And in this case, there's an upper confining bed above the artesian aquifer. So the water table aquifer really has a completely different water level, and that's the solid line in this picture that matches the stream. And so like here in Champaign County, the water level in our Mahomet aquifer might be 60 or 80 feet below land surface, where the top of the aquifer is maybe at 200, but our water table is only at 6 or 7 feet. They're not connected. They're hydraulically, they're just two different water services because there's confining units between the two. Okay.
Hey, Steve,
So a little bit.
Steve, can I just interrupt? Can you back up to the St. Peter, Ironton, Galesville? I just want to add a little anecdote. Sure. The two formations here, St. Peter Sandstone and Ironton, Galesville, these formations are named because of where these formations outcrop. As an example, St. Peter, Minnesota, that's outcrops on the banks of the Mississippi River near the Twin Cities, and Ironton and Galesville, I think they're both in Wisconsin. Ironton and Galesville, that's where these sandstones either outcrop or show up on a cliff or literally on the ground. So you can see how far away these formations get most of their recharge from. So I just wanted to add that. Typically the formations are named for where they outcrop.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And just like even the Mahomet here that's buried, and the Glassford, which is the shallower aquifer, the Glassford's a town along the Illinois River, and Mahomet's just 15 miles west of Champaign. And so geologists have a way of, when they named all that stuff back in the day, of using, where they could find materials to actually identify and catalog. So yeah, pretty cool. Thanks, Dick. Aquifers versus aquatards. So an aquifer is a saturated unit, sand and gravel, or rock formation that yields water of sufficient quantity. This is actually an argument among scientists and hydrologists and geologists about what it is and what isn't an aquifer. And the bottom line is, well, let me go further here. An aquatard is something that won't yield water. So it's clay, silt, granite most of the time. You might have a private well in granite, but you're very unlikely to have a community well or a large capacity well that's in that kind of material. So in that case, granite can be both, depending on your need. And that's what it comes down to. Different users or uses will define what an aquifer is or is not. We have even water table wells or dug and bored wells. Some people would say, well, they're in an aquifer then because they've got a sufficient supply for their home. Well, it could be a 3 or 4 inch sand stringer in an otherwise glacial till that provides just enough water for a few folks on a private wells. That won't supply a community water supply. And so really the bottom line is an aquifer usually is has a large quantity of water available, but that definition is kind of really up in the air depending on what your needs are. We have aquifers that'll supply 200 or 300 gallons a minute, but that wouldn't be enough for, say, a irrigation system because it wouldn't sustain that pumpage. And the other issue here, the other thing to describe is unconfined versus confined. Unconfined means it's at the water table, or it's got a free surface. And that means in the geologic unit, it's not full, and where the water is 100% saturated, that's the water table for that aquifer, and it's where it's saturated from then and below. But it means it's at atmospheric pressure at that surface. We're in a confined aquifer, as we showed on that example, it's water that's under pressure, and that's usually because of some other area like Dick just mentioned. For the St. Pete, it's all the way up by Minnesota. That's where water is actually getting in the aquifer, and it's causing a higher head there, and water wants to flow towards lower pressure to be level. Just like if I had when you fill up your bathtub, the water doesn't have different levels in it. It wants to be flat, and that's just the way water is. And so it's trying to be flat all the time. And so when you pump water out, or for some other reason there's water that's at a higher elevation, it's going to try to level the whole thing out and make the pressure head the same everywhere. And in a confined aquifer, that's why you see water levels rising in wells, and that's why it's called artesian. And I think we just showed an example, and maybe I'm going to show that again in a minute, but artesian doesn't mean flowing. Artesian means it's under pressure greater than 1 which is atmospheric pressure. It could be a flowing well, and that is also artesian, but artesian doesn't necessarily mean it's flowing. So just as an example, here's what this looks like. If this is one aquifer, there's a saturated part and an unsaturated part above that, the vadose zone. And so there's a water table, and you can, a well in there needs to be low enough in the unconfined aquifer, and then there's bedrock below. And a good example of this would be somewhere along a river bottom. Mason County, Illinois is called the Imperial Valley of the Midwest. It's there are 2,300 irrigation systems in, oh boy, I don't know, 300, 400 square miles. And it's all sand at the surface down to about 100 feet, and then you hit bedrock. And in some places, the water levels are only a few feet below land surface, and it is the water table, but it's also the aquifer in that case. Whereas in a confined aquifer situation, usually the confined aquifer is below some kind of confining layer, an aquitard, and so they can have totally different water levels versus the water table. So in this case, the upper unit of sand has the solid line water table, and a potentiometric surface, which is a pressure head, because all that confined aquifer down below is completely saturated, but it's also under pressure that makes the water level in that well rise to that level. And that's because of somewhere else in the aquifer, the water level is at least that high, if not higher, and it's pushing to lift that water up. Yeah, so confined aquifers versus an artesian wells. I borrowed this slide, so bear with me. So you can have, a normal an aquifer that the water level is above the top of the aquifer. That's artesian, and it's under pressure. The water table is completely different because it's between a confining layer. It can be higher or lower, I guess is the message there. It's really independent of the water table. And if it's there's enough pressure, then it will flow. And that's the situation we have in some places. I think there's a question someone asked about flowing wells, and I have some more information to provide in that segment when we get to the end. So just showing this again, flowing well versus a non-flowing artesian well is really just based on how high the well casing goes. If the land surface were lower on the right side, that well might be flowing as well. It's based on the pressure head of the water in the aquifer because of the recharge area that's kind of pushing the water up. And the other part is when you pump, what happens? So this is where permeability and porosity come in. There's two distinct figures here. One is a cross section at the top. So it's like we slice through the well in the middle and we're looking into the well from the side. And the other one's from above, and those are elevation lines. So at the pumping well, it's 400 feet above land surface is the MSL, is the water level in the well. The water level is always going to be lowest in the well where you're pumping. And then away from the well, it's going to go back to a certain point where the well doesn't influence the aquifer anymore. And that's this cone of depression. And so you can see in an ideal situation, which we don't have typically, where the sand is uniform, it's going to be very uniform circles. It's going to look just like this. The distance between the circles is going to be the same, and there's no other influences. How wide and how deep this goes depend on how much water is available and what the permeability is, which means how fast can the water get back in to fill in. It's trying to fill in to be level again. And when you're pumping, you lower the water level in the well, and that creates a head difference. And so water's flowing towards the well, kind of like you pulling the plug on a drain in your bathtub again. So the size and the magnitude of this is totally dependent on the amount of water available, the thickness of your aquifer, saturated thickness, if it's and the permeability and porosity, so much water is really available. So you can cause different things to happen if you have a well field. If they're too close together, usually you're spacing wells based on, it's one of the things that we do, we've provided in the past to communities when they want to put in a well field, is we'll help them design how far apart they should be so that you don't have this well interference between wells. But you can see what that looks like with the water level surface on the bottom. And water is trying to draw from, a well is trying to draw from 360 degrees around it. it's taking water in from all directions. So having another well somewhere means in that direction they're competing for the same water, so to speak. And if you're near a boundary, then you have other issues. Again, there's not as much water available because you're on the edge of the aquifer. And so it's going to cause a non-uniform distribution of drawdown because it's taking more water away out of the storage of the aquifer because it's just not available because of the boundary there. In the same way, if you have a constant head, a river, and you're pumping, you can pump a lot more closer to the river because it's going to keep adding water into the aquifer if it's connected hydraulically and cause less drawdown over a shorter distance because of that. So, and the river acts as a boundary. So you can see on the picture on the bottom here that on the right side of the river, the water levels are doing what they typically do. And this is in a typical groundwater system. Like if you look up at the top on the right side of the river, you see how there's a dotted line that shows that eventually the river is the surface elevation of the aquifer. And that's what you have in most situations along rivers, is the higher head is moving towards lower head. And so in this case, water in the aquifer is moving towards the river and discharging into it because it's at a lower elevation and it's constant. So some other things I wanted to bring up that you need to consider, especially, so we have, I'm downstate, but we have the Chicago area, which is 6 million people and growing. And we look at water use because communities are required to provide us that information every year. And then we also have all the information on the thickness, past drawdown, pumping tests from the bedrock aquifers, the deep and shallow up there. And so we were able to put together, this is probably 15, 20 years ago we put these together. And so it's worse today, but where the estimated yield of the aquifer is being, at what percentage of the yield is in use already. So that means there's no more available. And so everything in red on the picture on the right means more than 90% of the available yield is already being taken. And this was in, I think, 2002, these were put together. So there is a problem in the Chicago area, and we're actually working, one of the largest pumpers today is the city of Joliet. And I know there's a lot of folks working both at the State Water Survey and with the city of Joliet and some of its neighbors and the people they provide water to look at options for trying to do something different, because the water levels in the deep aquifer there are going down, and eventually they're going to run out of water. And so they need to find an alternate source. And it's estimated from the modeling we've done that'll happen in 2030. And so understanding this information, and if you plan to grow as a community, and if you're already have a marginal water supply for the people you have and you want to draw business in, you need to have an idea of where you stand and how much water is available from your aquifer. If you're ever going to have any issues with that or competition for water. In some parts of the country, obviously there's a lot of competition for water already out west, and there's a lot more rules in place than there are like in Illinois and some of the states of, I guess, east of the Mississippi. But it's just information that will help you understand how to protect the future of your community water supply. And lastly, contamination can be natural or man-made. And I bring this up because this picture on the right, let's go there first. That is the deep bedrock aquifer. And if you look at the aquifer is the colored part. I think that's gray, I'm colorblind. But it's a very smooth line going through the center of the state where the aquifer exists and doesn't exist. That's an arbitrary man-made line, because further south, the deep aquifer has too high chlorides. It's saltwater. And down in southern Illinois, there's places where the TDS is close to 10,000. And so it's not a potable water supply unless you're going to desal it. And so you can see down in the southern, or well, the southern part of the aquifer, but that's still in the northern part of the state. But the lowest parts, so the southernmost parts of this aquifer, the chloride values are higher, as much as 250 already, which is, I think, the secondary taste threshold. I can't see this because I've got a thing in the way here. Yeah, but as you move north, it's less, and so it's still used as water supply. That is migrating north because they've lowered heads in the very northern part of the state, and so the higher salinity water is moving north. But that's all natural occurring. The middle picture is shallow sand and gravel. That's our sand and gravel aquifers. And you can see it's kind of a mix. We have an area near here that we're on the Muhammad Aquifer, but we have an area about 30 miles from here where there is some high, chloride values around 200. And that's because they're upwelling through the bedrock into the sand and gravel aquifer, which is interesting. But the picture on the left are rivers and streams, and the scale is different here. It only goes up to 100. But you can see what we've done in the Chicago region or in the collar counties because of all the urbanization and the use of road salt. So we've affected certainly all our surface water supplies, and not even getting into the ecology and all those other things that folks worry about. But just from the groundwater perspective or the water use perspective, all that goes somewhere, and it's all draining and getting into our streams and rivers. And so that's changing a lot of stuff, especially we don't have a lot of data for the shallow sand and gravel, but some communities have wells in that. And what have I done here? Okay, so these are some Collar County, these are Shallow King County, which is a Collar County to the Chicago region, and some of the communities up there. This is their public water data. And you can see what's happened over time with chloride, and that's due to road salt. And so even if some of the shallow aquifers up there, are going to be either require more treatment or will be unusable because of some of the things we've done in that respect. And I just wanted to point that out. So that's what I have on groundwater and wells today. I'll bring up our class in a few minutes and then talk more about that, but I want to talk a little bit about wateroperator.org. Many of you probably have not heard of it in the past. Hopefully some of you have. This is the web page, and it is just www.wateroperator.org. It's a free resource for you as an operator with information on training and on any topic related to water and wastewater. And so it's what it is really is a clearinghouse of information. So what we've done, and our staff, we've vetted all this information from state agencies, federal agencies, technical assistance providers, associations, others in the water industry that are there to help and provide resources. And we put it all in one place. So we've done all the legwork, so it's easy to use. We've created a pretty simple system to use to search, and it's really easy to use as far as it's free and it's publicly available information. So we only link to things that we've vetted and we know are useful. So there's no junk, like if you search on Google, you get all the ads and everything else, none of that. It's meant to be here to support operators. And if you are trying to find something and you can't, you can call us or email us. It's on our website at the bottom of the front page. To get help, we'll look stuff up for you. We've printed out things in color and mailed them to operators where they don't have a color printer, all kinds of those sorts of things, because that's our job, to be honest. We're funded to provide support to systems. By doing the legwork, we link to over 15,000 documents. We put in over 13,000 events into a national calendar. So you can go to our calendar, I'll show you an example, and look for every training event in every state. We play no favorites. We link to everyone, anyone who provides training that's worth CEUs, or we feel it's valuable and it's free, even if it doesn't have CEUs, we link to it. And as I mentioned, these are the RCAPs, the Rural Water Associations, Water Environment Associations, and WEF, all those folks, and some other vendors that are in the training world that have resources. And we try to put logic into this. What we actually did When the arsenic rule changed in 2006, we brought in, or we worked with about 30 small systems, and I mean really small, most of them under 500 people, that weren't going to meet the arsenic rule, and looked at ways for them to meet the rule without having to add treatment, because they didn't have a lot of resources for that. And I'll give an example of that in a little bit. But after that was done, we got ready to start this program. We brought 15 of those guys in, gave them lunch, and asked them to help us. Some of them had never really used a computer. We're talking, small town operators in their 70s. And we used those guys to make sure that we set this up in a way that was understandable and easy to use. And so hopefully we've done that. So when you go to our website, the first thing most people do is go to our event calendar, and that's what I'm going to do. And if you click on event calendar on the top menu, it brings you to this page, which, Hideyuki, who was on the call a few minutes ago, led the webinar on RTCR. We recorded that, and it's available if you didn't know about it. And today is April 23rd, groundwater and well care. But if you go down to the search part of this, and I say state equals Illinois, it brings up all of this training that's available in Illinois. And from every kind of organization, even like TPC Trainco that does electric training, if it's worth CEUs, we list it. Like on the 1st of April, there was a TPC training event. There's a lot of trainers most operators may not even know about. So we try to find that information. We even have trainers contact us and say, I come to Illinois, or I come to whatever state. I'm showing you Illinois, but we have all the states listed here. So let me go back. If there's 3 or more events on the same day, it just lists the acronym for the organization. But then if you narrow it down, I said type equal webinar because that's most relevant for today for all of us. A lot of the in-person training has been postponed or canceled. And so it turns out only Section AWA is one of the, they've been doing a lot of webinar training for years. And so they've got a lot of things already in place, and they've been doing this for a long time. And so you can narrow it down that way. Instead of type, I could have clicked on categories like arsenic or groundwater rule or certification training. And you can narrow it down through the selection process at the top. I didn't think I'd have enough time to really go through, so I didn't include all of that. But if I click on the bottom here on the event from on AWIA on the 28th, this pops up, and it's a separate window, and it gives you all the details: how much it costs, if there is a cost, who to contact, how many credits it's worth, and a link back to that group's website. So we do this for every Rural Water Association, every AWA section, every WEA that does training, every operator group that we know of that does training. We have a few operator groups in Illinois that actually don't have a website, and we're on their mailing list, and they send us a PDF. We put the PDF on our website and then provide that link and information so that operators can find it. And so the idea behind this is to provide all the details quickly. I can go in and click on 4 or 5 of these events and see which ones I might be interested in. And they're from every kind of provider, even like Hawk or Blue Book, when they go to a state and do some kind of training. If they went to the trouble to get CEUs for it, we list it. If I just look for webinar, this is a lot more full than it used to be. 2 years ago, there would have been maybe 10 events in the whole month. Now I'm only showing you a part of the calendar because that's all it'll fit on the screen. And that's just because of the world we live in today. There's so many webinars and so many groups doing them. There's a few that stand out that have been doing webinars for a long time. I mentioned Illinois Section, the other one's RCAC. They're really active out west in there's 13 states I think they cover where they've been doing webinars for years. And so, and US EPA has a webinar series. There's for small systems. If you're not aware of that, email us and I'll get you the information. It's really good information. They bring in experts from around the country to talk about specific topics, and those are all recorded. And so there's just a lot of useful resources for you, especially if you now maybe have a little time to actually look into some of that. Most of these are recorded and they're available so you can learn. So there's too many here. The other option I have then is to click on the select button and pick another category to search on, or I can type in the keyword filter, which is over on the right. And so I just typed in COVID to see what would happen, and actually, there's a lot of training available today on what's going on in the world. And so things I'll point out here, there's a lot of different groups, but it doesn't mean you can't log in. When you click on any of these, like for the Michigan AWA section that was on the 13th, it may say credits only accepted in Michigan. But so what? If it's something you're interested in, if it's a topic that you want to learn more about, you should still participate. And the other thing I'll mention is these ITCA USET events are for tribal operators. ITCA and USET are the two tribal organizations that are approved through EPA for the tribal certification program to certify tribal operators. And so if you're a tribal operator, there's opportunities for you there too. In addition, I should say, not two. Obviously, you can go to all the others. The other side of this is a document search. I said we link to 15,000 documents or so. When you go to the resource library and then click on search documents, you come to this page. Quickly, like I said, you could search by category, type, state, or host. And so the categories are either wastewater, water, or both. And you can see the categories we've broken these into. There's only 32 categories and there's 15,000 documents. So some of them have quite a few documents anyway. So you need to try to find a way to narrow that down. But there's also things on safety, utility management, financial management. Every topic that could interest you as a water or wastewater operator, we've tried to cover it. And if you can't find something, again, email us or call us. I had an operator call this morning and I showed him part of the site because he was looking for a certain thing and I just walked him through it. It's a really good resource. It's easy to use. And so, for example, I mentioned arsenic earlier and some of the issues we had in Illinois. If I search for arsenic as a category, there's 187 documents that are available. For each one, the title is a link to the actual document. And then there's a summary and a source page because a lot of organizations still have all their documents on one page. And so we tried to include that so that you can get to all their documents at once, and then who the host is. And so some of these, so the nice thing is you can scroll through these quickly without actually having to download it. So if your connection isn't great or it's a really large document, you can just scroll through and read the summaries and decide what you might and might not like. So what we did with the operators in Illinois, one of the things we used to help solve their arsenic problems is that arsenic co-precipitates with iron, at least it does in the groundwater in Illinois. So for a few systems, their solution was to actually add iron, even though they already had high iron, to help remove more arsenic. It means they backflow a little more often, but it was a way to actually use their current system to remove the arsenic they needed to remove. And so as an example of that, if I search for in the keywords then, I've already clicked on arsenic, now I add iron. So you can see below that it says filters are arsenic and iron. There's 34 records. And so as I scroll through those, number 8 says arsenic removal during iron removal. That's exactly what I'm looking for, right? And this happened to be a PowerPoint presentation. There's videos on here, there's handbooks and manuals, a lot of PowerPoint presentations, or at least the slide deck as a PDF from other organizations, but this happened to be from US EPA. So Darren Lytle is an arsenic expert, someone that states call whenever they have a real problem system to help solve that. And this is his presentation. But what's cool about this is he went through what they did on a full-scale plant in Michigan. And so they were trying to remove arsenic and manganese. And this is the way the system was set up. So when they put chlorine in at the end, they got 50% removal of arsenic. And then when they tried moving that before the filters, they still saw only 50% removal. But they realized that if they put it back where the water is coming out of the ground and let it run through the whole system, now for the same chlorine, the same cost, the same everything, now they're getting 75% arsenic removal versus 50% just because of the added contact time. And so it's things like that that they've been able to research that are practical. If you find this information and it fits your need, or if you need help finding that, we can help you. But it's just this is freely available on their website, and so we link to it. Lastly, I want to talk about, so this webinar is called Groundwater and Wells, or Groundwater and Well Care. It's based on a class we have This started out as a non-community class. It turns out, most non-community water systems, if they are their own water system, it's because they have a well. And in many cases, if it's a campground or a restaurant or a small business that's in the country, or even a school, they're not in the business of being a water purveyor. They have their own business or their own thing to do, and their well's very much like a private well. So we put together this class initially for non-community water systems, and then realized that it was also beneficial to community water supplies and all public water supplies. So we went and made it that way, so to speak. So it's basically groundwater and wells. You click on this link, and again, it's under the resource library. It brings you up to this page, groundwater and well care for public water systems. If you scroll down the page, it's a free class. It's been approved for 2 hours in the states that are listed here. And if you want to know how it works in your state, if you're one of these states, like, in Georgia, it's only worth 1 continuing education credit, in North Dakota, but in the others it's 2. And Arizona has different rules, but there's this button, see state-specific instructions to receive credit. And so it's on you to identify what your needs are, all those things, but here's a class you can take. It's online, it's self-paced, and it could provide you with a few CEUs as well. But the idea here is really to help folks understand groundwater in their well better, as they go. So that's available on our website as well, and you can email us if you have questions. Other things, well, this is what the class looks like. It's 6 chapters all together. Like I said, it's either 2 or 1 hour. It's pretty, it is pretty basic for coming in as a groundwater hydrologist, but it gives you all the concepts that you need to understand groundwater flow and all those things. And I've used different examples today, but the same issue with how flow works and how long water can flow through the system, groundwater kind of is lost in that. And so when you're done, after you've done all 6, you have to take a quiz. I think there's a quiz, a few questions at the end of each section, but then at the end you have to take a bigger quiz. And if you complete that, you get a certificate. And again, if you're in one of those states, you can use that with them to do whatever. It's actually the only class we have. We're not in the business of being a trainer. We're in the business of trying to help you all find training you need from other purveyors and to make sure that you are aware of all the possible trainings that are available in your state. But this is a niche for us, mainly because we're groundwater people. And so when we were asked to set this up, we decided we'd go ahead and do it. The last thing I have before we get to the questions is we have a newsletter. We actually have 3 newsletters. We have a regular wateroperator.org newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks. There's no fluff in it. It's you can go look on our website. There's a newsletter button, and you can see all the past issues. But it provides real working, useful information about either the new rules that have passed or a new video we found that talks about some topic that's relevant to water or wastewater, and it's for both. Our whole site is called wateroperator.org. Water's the same, either it's before or after the tap, and so we represent both. And just like the gentleman I talked to this morning, he does both for his community, and that's the case for many small systems. And so that's who we want to serve. If you're into this, you can even text tap water to that number, and we can sign you up. But it's really useful. I encourage you to go on our website and take a look at a few because I think you'll see that they're worthwhile, and it comes to your email every other week. There's one going out hopefully later today or tomorrow. And I mentioned we have 3 newsletters. This one goes out every 2 weeks. We have a tribal newsletter that's really for tribal operators and those that serve them. It goes out once a month. It's called Tribal Utility News. And then we also have one that's based on new technologies and a lot of things that are going on in the water treatment development game, if you will. And that also goes out once a month. And you can sign up for all 3 there if you're interested. So we had a number of questions submitted. We're going to go through a number of those. There were too many. There's 173 people on here. There were I think there were 300 registered, so we got a lot of questions, but we're going to answer those that we can. and that's why Dick's here. And so Jennifer and Katie, I guess, are both monitoring our chat box and our question box. If you have any questions, you can add them there that aren't on this list. But we're going to get right to those. And the way we're going to do this is, Dick, you need to unmute yourself. And I'm going to ask the question and Dick's going to answer it. And if I have anything to add, like what's the 80-20 rule, I'm just going to step in. So first question we got was, what are the recommended O&M practices for well care and wells with high iron and manganese? Go ahead,
All
Dick.
right, thank you. Routine schedule maintenance is recommended with scheduling dependent upon severity. Every well, no matter where you are, through the years, you're gonna pretty much get into a routine of knowing when you need to remove your equipment. If you're unsure, of course, stop for a minute. If we throw other things into it, if you got iron bacteria and you get that into the mix, and then you can have more of an issue and have to treat the well more frequently because you do not want to let this thing go unattended. The main point I want to make is to monitor your well's specific capacity. That's basically the efficiency of your well. Specific capacity is defined as your gallons per minute being pumped divided by your drawdown being the difference between your static level and your pumping level. You come up with a number, and you want to know what that number is when the well was drilled and keep track of it. We like to use the 80-20 rule. That was developed by a man named Neil Mansui years ago, and it's a pretty good rule. You can work with it a little bit, but the reason behind it is that if you drop 20% in your production and you've got iron and manganese creating problems either with your well formation or even with your pumping equipment, when you reach that 20%, that's when it is most economical for you to do something. The problem we run into is people let things go and let them go and let them go. And then you get into the 20-80 rule where you've decreased 80%. And it's just like your paint on the outside of your house or your rust spot on your car. You let it go, it's going to be more of a problem to get it taken care of at a later time. So it's best to keep up with that and monitor. Your levels of iron and manganese can also be an indicator as your well becomes plugged up and your pore spaces become filled up with iron bacteria and other minerals. You can be pumping water from a different area in the well instead of the good area that you want to get it from, and oftentimes you'll see a change in your water quality. It could be a positive or a negative. Usually it's a negative. Period.
All right. Thanks, Dick. I'll make sure I didn't just skip one. No, good deal. Okay. So what are the best methods to troubleshoot a well that has developed variable GPM and quality of water produced to determine if it's a pump, screen, or quantity of water problem?
Well, this is actually a segue from the last question right into this one. And again, watching what your water quality levels have done. Typically, sometimes when we rehab a well, the operator will put the equipment back online, and they'll find that they have elevated levels of chlorine or free chlorine in the system, and they want to know what's going on. Well, the reason is that the well was plugged so bad that you were pumping high levels of iron, or maybe throw some ammonia into the mix to really mess things up. And after the well's rehabbed, you're getting that better quality water, and you don't need as much chlorine. So you want to really keep track of your water quality levels. Keeping track of your performance is a must. Too many times we have a client that says, "Oh, my pumps broke down." We go out and we ask them, well, what are your records? What's been happening? And they're like, "Well, we don't keep any records." And that's the tough part, because we come in and we'll do the work, put the pump back in, fix the broken shaft or fix the burned out motor. And after you put the pump back in, we'll find that the well has a very bad specific capacity problem. So you've lost all that time of removal of the pump. So if you can monitor things, if you got a SCADA system, it should be basically automatic, and keep track of those so that you know exactly what's going on and you can head it off before it gets to be too much of a problem. Period.
Great, thanks. Okay. So at what frequency should wells be cleaned and inspected?
All right. People always ask that question. How long does your pumping equipment last? How often do I have to pull the well? With father and grandfather back to 1916, we've always used the 7 to 10 year is a pretty good guess. We have some clients that do something every 5 years. We have others that you can pull a pump after 20 years and you can still see the stenciling on the pipe. So much of that is dependent upon what your water quality is. Again, getting back to your history, what has been the history of the well? When do the holes develop in the column pipe that you got to pull it? When does the specific capacity drop to a point that I need to do something? Am I drawing suction? Again, the 80-20 rule is a good thing. Sometimes your insurance companies will dictate. We have a client that has 5 wells and he pulls 1 well every year and rotates. And he has never had a breakdown. And you can say that he's investing maybe his money unwisely, but I guess he's sleeping well at night with how he does it. Period.
So yeah, I was going to ask, when you said 7 to 10 years, it is. I mean, you already answered it, I guess, but it is really based on chemistry, because we see the same things with private wells. We see some where they've had the same, they could last 60 years, where that's not the case in some areas. So interesting.
Yeah, house wells. I mean, yeah, it's not uncommon to have the one that's been in for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
Bless them.
Yeah. I had actually a coworker who had bought a house, and it's the original pump from like the 60s, and he just replaced it. So pretty fortunate. All right. Well contamination remediation. I threw this in. I figured we could talk about it a little bit because what you said as an answer is certainly correct. And I don't know if you want to elaborate, but
I
pretty
think
wide open.
Yeah, it is pretty wide open. What we typically see, house residential wells, we're typically looking at either a septic field type infiltration, or in Wisconsin, even some Illinois area, we run into arsenic issues, and you run into chemical spills, or someplace near factories where they haven't done things so well in the past and done some disposal. So a lot of that is dependent upon what the element is or what the problem is, to try to find out where it's coming from. So you really gotta watch, what is the contamination? Is it a fuel spill? Is it a landfill? Is it chemical? Is it arsenic from years of too much fertilizer on the farm fields? You just don't know what it could be.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's enough said. Those are specific issues, and we as an agency stay out of most of the remediation stuff. It's just there's others that are much more involved in that, and it's kind of a specialty there. So as far as drawdown tests, how often should drawdown tests be done on a well?
Well, as I state, house wells, residential type applications, you're usually going to see something happening. You're not going to have an airline where you can monitor the water level, but some hot summer is going to come along when you used to be able to run 2 or 3 sprinklers, and now you can only run 1, or you can't run the dishwasher when your wife's in the shower because she's yelling at you for no water. So that's usually the indicator from a house residential aspect. But from a municipal aspect where you do have an airline or a transducer to monitor your water level, I would at a minimum do it once per month to keep track of it. And again, write it down, put it on a table, chart it if you can, because graphs are easy to read, and you may not see it initially. So you put that on the graph. Plus, if you have to show it to your board members or your village president, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and they see that declination of the curve or the straight line. That's easy for someone to understand than a table full of numbers.
Certainly. So, yeah. And nowadays, you know, like a lot of our monitoring well networks around the state, we have telemetry on so that we can put them up. We have hourly readings, and you can go back and look at what's been going on just an hour ago, even from, 4 hours away. It's kind of cool. Okay. So artesian wells have been discussed, and this is Dick's answer that's written here. Please explain how artesian well operates differently from a standard well. It doesn't, and I'm going to go ahead and answer this, Dick, because I wanted to show this handbook.
Go for it.
What Dick said here is really the static level is just above land surface, and we've already shown how that is. There's only some places where wells flow. This handbook from Michigan, the Flowing Well Handbook, they were losing, and you can read this, and I can get folks this book if they're interested. But it's got some cool stuff in it. It's got diagrams showing how you can, how you cap a well that's flowing and all those things. Michigan was losing 28 million gallons a day of groundwater to flowing wells, and so they passed a law or rule that requires you to cap them now. And so what I found this book, what's cool in it is it's got, in the appendices, it's got things on like how to calculate the flow based on how high the water comes up out of the well and the diameter of the pipe. And there's a horizontal one, and there's diagrams in it. And it's mostly for private wells, which I won't talk about private wells anymore. But it's pretty interesting to look through, and especially if you have a flowing well for your supply. But yeah, I think the most important message that you gave, Dick, is that even if it is a flowing well, once you start pumping it, it's usually operating, the pumping level is usually well below land surface. Would that be fair to say?
That'd be very fair to say.
All right. So there was a question, is there a way to tell if a well is under the influence of surface water besides MPA testing? Which is, I had to look all this up, be honest, microscopic particulate analysis. And what I found basically is that it really depends on your state, what they're using for the rules to decide. And I understand this question may not have been, what do I have to do? But are there other ways for me to do this to determine? And there's really probably two. One is you can look at the differences in the chemistry, because the groundwater chemistry is different than surface water chemistry. Matter of fact, when I give a sample to our lab, if it's a surface water sample, sometimes they'll come back and say, hey, this isn't a groundwater sample. We know this is surface water. And it's just by the constituents and the way the chemistry is, it's completely oxidized, all that sort of stuff. And the other thing you can do is you can tell if it's connected, maybe not, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's under the influence as far as pathogens and things like that. But if it's hydraulically connected, then you'll see the water levels mimic the river stage and that sort, or the water body a little closer. And we see that we have some monitoring wells along the Illinois River. We have telemetry on 10 of 14 wells, and 2 of the wells we don't put telemetry on. It's because we can use the river stage and subtract 5 feet, and it's probably within less than 1/10 of an inch of what the water level is in that well, because it's so connected to the river. And so there are other ways. And I put this up. This outline is from a document from Idaho DEQ, and I just put this up here, I guess to, if they require you to follow these steps, and I'm sure most states have these same rules. I saw several online and through the stuff we have. And I just, if your question wasn't that, if it was really that you want to do something besides MPA testing, I think you have to follow your state rules. But if you're really asking for your own benefit, I think there's other two ways will both could be helpful. And that's, if you want more information about that, I can dig into it more because, I had to look up what MPA was, to be honest. And so, yeah. Is there a good way to tell if the drinking water is impacted by a septic system? And is there a good way to tell the difference between ag impacts, say manure spreading, and a septic system impact? So there really isn't a simple way to distinguish between manure and septic, other than you'd have to look at the type of pathogens. And there are approaches that are being developed. I know there was a guy on the U of I campus who was able to use certain kind of testing to determine if the bacteria were from a cow, a horse, a pig, in a karst area where they were trying to figure out what was causing their bacteria problems in some private wells in an area. But that's expensive and not common, and certainly probably not accepted. One of the things that was recommended to me was a good way to look for human, or if it's human pathogens, if you look for those, or pharmaceuticals and personal care products. And a great example, if you find caffeine in the result, then it's probably septic, if that's what you're trying to distinguish. So, or you can look at some other, constituent too that would be a very common. Caffeine's got to be one of the more common ones, though. So it was a great idea, and that was suggested by Walt Kelly. How important is it for a small water system to have a secondary water source? So about 15 years ago, when the U of I and the Water Survey were involved with the Midwest Technology Assistance Center, we looked at all the small systems in the state and found 73 that didn't have a second well or some other secondary source of water. And which really, I was surprised by that many. And if your pump fails today, especially when you think about the COVID issue we're in right now, if your pump fails, how long before you have water again? Your supplier may not be able to supply everything you need. Your contractor may not be able to come out, or may have rules in place for their staff that don't allow that. And really, it comes down to you need to decide as a community, can your residents and businesses you have accept those kind of possibilities? And I realize this is probably a very small town. I don't know for sure because those are anonymous questions. But I would say that it's really of the utmost importance to have a secondary source, no matter what it is, even if it means you have a pipeline run into a neighboring community so that you can connect to a neighbor whenever something happens. And if you're, a lot of times an operator will know they need to do something about something and they can't get their village board or their mayor to agree. I'd be glad to say to your mayor, it's kind of irresponsible not to have a secondary source. And again, that's just my opinion. But you should have an emergency response plan that has that information in it, what you plan to do if you have to go to a secondary source, all that stuff. And, it's really important today, given, the situation we're all in, to realize how important that is, because, all the resources you're used to having available to you may not be available to you today, and certainly in person.
Hey, Steve. Yeah, a couple ideas to add to that. We're actually involved with one right now where they had a deep well and a small shallow well as a backup. And the deep well failed and they went to go onto the small shallow well and it was unable to keep up with their system demands, and it's just been a nightmare. So if you do have a backup well, hopefully you can set it up to alternate with your main well, or at least test it once in a while to make sure it's operating properly. And because when you need it, you're going to need it.
Yeah.
With that also, if you do put in a second well, it's very simple to say, well, I could put in a much smaller well. I just need it for backup. I only need it to last for a week or a few days. Be leery of what I just told you. That you do have enough water in that backup well to sustain what you need.
Yeah, and that goes back to having a good plan in place. We see folks who have generators, that need to be ran every month, and just to make sure they're working properly and all that stuff. And they haven't been turned on in years. And then when they go to use them, they don't have them. They won't work. So yeah, it's really, I mean, it's just good business practice, if you will, too. One other question was, someone asked, is this the same webinar that's scheduled for September? It is. So we're running it twice because really that's where our expertise is. And so we wanted to do a webinar every month through November, and we decided to run this one twice because it's, yeah, it's just what we decided to do. If there's interest in having something more advanced as a class for groundwater and wells, we can certainly put that together. You know, inviting folks like Dick who have that expertise, we could get into more issues. We just, if you let us know, we could work on that. It'd probably be next year when we did that. So a couple other questions for you, Dick.
All right.
What is this? What is a sleeve and how is it installed?
Well, a sleeve, you can look at it two ways. One, it could be a smaller diameter pipe that you're installing inside your existing well. That's more called a liner. So if you have a 12-inch well, you have to put an 8-inch piece of pipe on the inside, and you typically put cement in between the two. That's a liner. A sleeve, I believe what they're asking is a stainless steel corrugated, basically like a straw or a piece of pipe that you lower down into the well and swedge, S-W-E-D-G, swedge it into place. Sometimes we'll run into a situation where we'll pull a pump and televise a well, and there's a hole in the casing allowing bad water to come in, or a screen has deteriorated and we need to put in a patch. So a sleeve is just like a patch. These sleeves come in 5-foot lengths. Typically we put in stainless steel for obvious reasons. You want to put this in and have it last a long time. We'll oftentimes put a rubber backing on the outside so you can adhere to whatever you're putting it up to. You want to make sure that the casing or the screen or wherever you're putting this in the well construction is clean, because it's like anything you do, the cleaner it is, the better the bond's going to be. The sleeve is made to fit just inside the pipe, and you corrugate it. You make it look like a kind of like an accordion. If you're to take an accordion and cut it sideways, and you lower that sleeve down into the well. And I use the explanation of a post hole digger. You're going down and you're squeezing your material in to get it out of the hole. The swedge tool operates opposite of that. So you lower it down, it's hydraulically operated. It has 3 legs instead of 2 like you have on a post hole digger. And when you get down to the point where you want to expand your swedge, you hydraulically operate it, and these 3 prongs force out and swedge the liner in place. You do that multiple times, rotating it around so that you get a good seal. And we televise it before and after. Sometimes you put in a 5-foot piece, sometimes you put in multiple pieces that are put on top of each other, you know, 100 feet or more. It's very expensive, but it can save a well, and it's not a guaranteed fix. Sometimes these swedges don't last as long as you'd want them to, but it is a good way to patch a hole or another compromise in the well. And if someone has more specific questions, please feel free to somehow get in touch with me. I'm sure Steve will have information.
You can email us at info@wateroperator.org, and I'll make sure it gets to Dick.
Sure. Okay. Well construction and disinfection when replacing pumps and motors. This is pardon my expression, a real pain in the butt sometimes. We are very aware of how we do things. You know, when you pull a pump, you don't want it laying down on the ground in the dirt. You want it to be either on pipe or on timbers. You want it protected. We had one that was under a tree, and all the birds sat in the tree and crapped on the pipe. It was a real problem. We had to pressure wash the pipe. So you want to be aware of those things. When we go back in with equipment, we do three things. Number one, before we put the equipment in the well, we will chlorinate the well, whether it's with granular or liquid chlorine, and we calculate the borehole volume. We like to go 2 times the borehole volume with a solution, a minimum of 50 parts per million of chlorine. Then when we're installing the pump, we spray the inside and the outside of the pump. It's really high tech. You get a launch sprayer and fill it with chlorinated water and spray it on the way in, so that you take every precaution you can to kill anything that might have landed on the pipe, or who knows what. And then once we put the pumping equipment in the ground and pump that chlorine off, and of course we usually have to neutralize it because it's a higher concentration, so you want to be careful. You don't want any rock bass or trout floating up to the surface of the pond or stream that you're going into. You want to be careful, but sometimes we even have to go after the fact. If we've done all this and we still get a bad sample, we set up a system where we circulate chlorinated water down the well while we're pumping. To get a little technical here, there is a slug of water between your static level and your pumping level that literally floats up and down every time the pump operates. So when you run the well, you're really not able to pump that column between the static and the pumping out. So we add chlorinated water from the surface while we're pumping to flush that column of water out. It might be hard to understand, but I hope if you don't, I'll help later, or we can show pictures or something like that. But you have to take all the precautions you can to try to get that safe sample the first time, because it's a pain in the you know what.
Yep. All right. Okay. I know we do have some questions that have been asked today, so I'm going to pull those up. But so hang on. But I just want to remind everybody, thanks for attending. We do have more questions. I'm going to stop the PowerPoint presentation and pull up that Google Doc that Jennifer's been updating. So, and just a reminder, our newsletter is pretty cool. I recommend it highly, but I'm a little biased, I guess. Okay, so I'm going to make this full screen. I'm going to increase the size a little bit here. Whoa, okay, maybe that's too big. Oh yeah, so we have an issue here that's going off my screen, I think. There we go. Okay, is clay, quote, relatively permeable, or should it be relatively impermeable due to its low ability to flow water? It should be relatively impermeable. Did I say permeable? Because I hopefully did not. And so, yeah, it's relatively impermeable. It does not allow water flow, and that's why it's considered an aquitard. And usually, you're going through a clay layer to get to a sand and gravel or down to bedrock to an aquifer. I noticed some well illustrations, not from your agency, refer to use of a pitless adapter. Does Illinois allow a pitless adapter for public water system wells, or do you require a factory pitless unit? Dick, that's for you, because I have no idea.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, Illinois does allow pitless adapters for public water systems, and they do require that they be factory manufactured. There's really, I think, 3 now, Baker Monitor in Evansville, Wisconsin, Moss in Roscoe, Illinois, and there's a new one out. I'm trying to think of it, Bosshart or something like that, that's working their way into it. But yes, you can install pitless adapters.
Okay. Hopefully that's a little bigger and people can read it. I am a tribe in Montana and operate majority of groundwater systems with 500 or less hookups. Where should I be looking for daily operations and O&M plan? Well, I'd like to say you can probably find some of that on our website, but if you'll email us, we'll look into it. And yeah, and have you talked to Idaho DEQ? Or well, yeah, I guess you guys probably don't work with them. And I can also contact MAP, or you guys are probably part of RCAC's network, and get someone back to help you. And that's part of the deal. You know, RCAP has staff in every state, so it's kind of handy. And so, or maybe you already work with them. Oh, you're in Montana. Oh, okay. For some reason, I thought Idaho. I'm sorry. Yeah, if you'll email us at info@wateroperator.org, I will get back to you with an answer to that. Because I'm not sure without looking if we have any operations and O&M plans on our website. That'd be the thing to do, would be to look in our keyword search. But I'm not 100% sure without looking. And so let me do that, and I can do that after the webinar and get back to you. Kevin Kundert is also in Montana. I don't know if you know him. He's with the RCAP National Office. He's a water and wastewater operator. He can probably help, or someone from the regional affiliate. So I'll leave it at that. Okay, the next thing is a comment. It says, you will find caffeine in surface water. The wastewater plants can't remove it. Yeah, and I think I was looking at that as a groundwater issue with a septic system. And I'm sure that's the case. And if you're on a, since this is a groundwater and wells class, I was not, didn't have surface water on my radar at all. I know there's communities that have both. We have 2 in Illinois that have both wells and pull out of the Fox River. So that can certainly be the case. But thank you for the information. So does the TOC procedure include an air purge step to eliminate the VOCs? And if VOCs are part of TOC, does that mean that SOCs are also included? Isn't TOC total organic carbon? I know VOCs volatile organics.
SOCs are synthetic.
Huh?
SOCs are synthetic.
Right.
Yeah.
But what are TOCs? Well, so that's a totally different thing. Yeah, I guess I don't know enough about this to answer your question. Again, if you'll email me, my boss probably can. He's a geochemist, and we can certainly even talk to one of the states to find out if there's a good answer for this. And I'm not sure what the TOC procedure is, because yeah, to me, TOC is total organic carbon, which is just a constituent, and obviously that's not right. And so I don't want to misspeak, if you will. So yeah, email me, and or email info@wateroperator.org, and that's our, again, not to belabor the point, but we'll find an answer for you from someone who actually does know. In this case, probably someone from one of the states. So. As a water operator, I suggest spending time and ask questions of your well contractor. That's very good advice. And I think Dick could probably speak to the clients that are really interested in the relationship they have there versus the ones that aren't, and they only deal with maybe the consultant or whatever. Anything to add, Dick?
Yeah, just make sure you, and I'm not underlying anything here, but you want to make sure that your contractor is giving you the straight scoop. Oftentimes, no matter who the contractor is in any business, they try to sell you what they have hot at the moment, and you want to double check some things. If your well contractor says, I recommend this process here, then you ask him, well, why don't you give me some references in the area or within a certain radius where you've done this successfully? Give me names and phone numbers so I can contact people and get input. So you want to do your homework, you want to do your diligence, and make sure that you're not getting what do they say, ice cubes to the Eskimos, so to speak.
Well, and unfortunately, that can happen. This comes up in a lot of different things, but it can happen in any business or any industry. We've run into cases where small systems had, valves that were, these state-of-the-art things that they really didn't need, and it turned out somebody got a kickback if they used them, and and those are few and far between, hopefully, and most people are doing their, have the better good in mind. But Dick's advice is actually exactly what, the more you know yourself and the more you're comfortable with the people you're working with and get to know them, it gives you that much more confidence that you're spending your money wisely and doing what's best for your community. And, so, that's all I have today. That's the last question. Thanks for everybody for attending. I'm sorry we're 15 minutes late here, but appreciate all those that stayed. And Dick, thank you very much for your time. And if there's any follow-up, I'll certainly get in touch with you. But
All right.
really appreciate all your advice and good information. And look forward to next month. We have a webinar. You can go to our webpage and click on event calendar, and it'll show you what we have in store next month for this webinar series. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jennifer and Katie. And have a safe and everyone be well and take care of your families. Take care.